In 1943, under the blazing Texas sun, Camp Hearn stood as one of America's biggest prisoner-of-war camps during World War II, holding thousands of German soldiers behind barbed wire in Robertson County. On the morning of July 23rd, three young Wehrmacht soldiers, Lieutenant Heinrich Miller, Corporal Franz Weber, and Private Klaus Schneider, stood near the camp's edge, staring at the endless prairie that stretched far beyond their prison. They had secretly planned an escape for weeks, believing that freedom awaited them across those plains, maybe leading to Mexico and eventually back to Germany. Heinrich, once an officer from Bavaria who had fought in North Africa before being captured near Tunis, whispered to his friends, "Tonight, when the guards switch at 2200 hours, we go." His English was rough, his tone determined. Franz, a tough farm boy from the Rhineland, gave a serious nod, while young Klaus, only 20, nervously held a hand-drawn map made from scraps of old American newspapers. The camp housed over 4,000 German prisoners, most taken from Rommel's Afrika Korps or captured U-boat crews. According to the Texas Historical Commission, Camp Hearn operated from 1943 to 1945 and could hold nearly 5,000 men. Prisoners lived in wooden barracks, worked in nearby fields, and somehow maintained a sense of military life. They formed bands, printed small newspapers, and even built a tiny theater for German plays. But Heinrich, Franz, and Klaus refused to accept their fate. They were soldiers, not men who would sit quietly in defeat. That hot July night, they prepared for their escape. They packed stolen rations, old bread, dried meat, and water in canteens. Heinrich had made crude wire cutters from metal scraps he found in the camp's workshop. Their plan was simple: cut through the fence during the guard change, run 300 yards across the open field to the trees, then follow the stars south. At exactly 10 p.m., as guards shifted, they crawled through the darkness. Each snip of the wire cutter echoed in the quiet night. Sweat poured down their faces. Finally, the fence opened just enough for them to slip through. Franz went first, then Klaus, trembling with fear and excitement, and finally Heinrich, who pulled the fence partly back into place. Once free, they ran with desperate energy, not as trained soldiers but as men chasing survival. The wide Texas prairie stretched endlessly before them, dotted with mesquite trees under a starlit sky. Heinrich led with a compass he had stolen weeks earlier. They had studied what little geography they could, believing they had only about 150 miles to reach Mexico. They imagined freedom awaited them there, but the Texas wilderness quickly proved them wrong. Unlike Europe's tidy farmlands, the vast rough prairie was endless and confusing. The temperature over 100-degree Celsius during the day dropped sharply at night, and they shivered in thin prison shirts. Klaus, the youngest, struggled through the tall grass, stumbling over rocks and holes. By dawn on July 24th, they had covered maybe 15 miles, though their zigzag route meant they had gone less. Exhausted, they hid in a dry creek bed surrounded by brush and tried to rest. Franz took first watch, knowing search teams would soon be after them. The U.S. Guards would discover their absence at morning roll call. According to records from the National World War II Museum, escapes from American POW camps were rare, but did happen. Most fugitives were caught within days, turned in by locals or found by police. Though the Geneva Convention required fair treatment of captured prisoners, failure itself often broke their spirit. When the heat grew unbearable by afternoon, Heinrich woke the others. They drank sparingly from their canteens and studied the rough map. Nothing made sense. The land didn't match what they had drawn. The streams, tree lines, and horizon looked unfamiliar. They were lost, completely lost in a land that felt alien and endless. "We keep moving south," Heinrich said firmly. "The border can't be far. We travel at night, rest by day, and avoid people." It was a good plan in theory, but none of them were trained for the wilds of Texas. Meanwhile, about 30 miles northwest, 62-year-old ranch foreman Samuel "Sam" McKenzie saddled his horse at the Double J Ranch. He had worked cattle since he was 14 and knew every inch of that land. His face was roughened by decades of sun and hard work. That morning, July 25th, Sam gathered 4 of his best cowboys for their usual patrol. There was 28-year-old Billy Patterson, famous for his skill with a lasso. 35-year-old James Cooper, a black cowboy whose family had been horsemen since the Civil War. 41-year-old Roberto Sanchez, whose roots in Texas went back generations. And 19-year-old Tommy Wilson, young but eager to learn. Got a call from Camp Hearn's commander, Sam told them as they checked their gear. 3 German prisoners broke out 2 nights ago. The military's searching near the camp, but the sheriff asked us to keep watch out here. They're on foot, heading south, likely scared and hungry. If we find them, we don't hurt them. They're soldiers, not criminals. Just bring them back safe. The men nodded. Out here, the war felt far away, though they all had family fighting overseas. The German prisoners had become a familiar sight in the area, working in fields or helping with harvests under guard. Locals saw them with mixed feelings. Enemies, yes, but also young men far from home, much like their own sons. According to Texas A&M University's records, locals across Texas often helped authorities capture escaped POWs during the war. Ranchers, sheriffs, and everyday citizens viewed it as their duty while American troops fought abroad. The teamwork between the Army officers and local Texans worked extremely well, as most escape attempts ended within 3 days. Sam and his men rode across the Northwest Plains with the ease of people who knew every inch of the land, the streams, the trees, and the uneven ground. They spread out in a wide line, carefully watching for footprints, broken plants, or anything that showed someone had passed through. Billy rode in front, one hand resting near his lasso. James watched the east side, Roberto the west, while young Tommy stayed close to Sam, learning how to read signs in the land. Around noon, Roberto gave a sharp whistle. The others rode over to him, and he pointed to some footprints near a dry creek bed. 3 sets of boots, he said, kneeling to inspect the dirt. Military issue. Looks like they passed maybe 12 hours ago, heading southwest. They're moving slow, not used to this country. Can't be far ahead. The cowboys followed the trail calmly and steadily, reading the ground like it was a story. Every scuff, bent grass stem, or shifted rock told them something. Sam noticed the escapees were trying to hide their tracks, but were doing a poor job of it. Their European training didn't fit this rough Texas terrain. Their footprints were uneven, showing exhaustion, and they seemed to stop often near dry creek beds, probably looking for water. They're going toward the Brazos River Valley, James said, studying the direction. Maybe they think it'll lead them south or to towns or water. But that's rough country. Ravines, thick brush, snakes big as your arm. If they don't know what they're doing, they'll be in trouble before we reach them. The men pressed on, their horses trotting steadily across the open prairie. These were tough-working horses, built to travel far without tiring. Billy often rode ahead and then circled back to make sure the trail was right. The sun burned overhead, and they stopped at times to give their horses water and short rests, knowing that pushing too hard could cost them time later. By mid-afternoon on July 25th, they noticed movement near a line of trees in the distance. Sam raised his hand to stop the group. They quietly dismounted and led their horses forward, keeping low behind a shallow ridge. As they got closer, they heard faint voices, Germans arguing softly. The cowboys exchanged looks. They had found them. Under the shade of cottonwood trees sat Hinrich, Franz, and Klaus, exhausted and weak. Their water was nearly gone, their feet bloody and blistered from long walking in thin shoes. Klaus lay on the ground, overheated and barely conscious, while Franz and Hinrich argued about whether to rest or search for water. They hadn't eaten in almost a day, and their strength was fading fast. They were lost, desperate, and in a land they didn't understand. According to wartime records, many German prisoners who escaped in Texas died not from capture, but from the brutal conditions, heat, dehydration, or even wild animals. Sam and his men carefully spread out in a half-circle around the Germans, staying downwind so the horses wouldn't alert them. Sam knew these men were scared and might react violently. He'd spent his life handling nervous cattle and wild horses. He understood fear. The trick was to act fast and calm. He gave Billy a small hand signal. Billy nodded and began preparing his lasso quietly. James and Roberto took positions to block escape routes, while Tommy stayed with the horses, watching wide-eyed as his first real chase unfolded. Sam stood up slowly, tall and firm, his voice ringing out across the clearing. "You boys might as well come on out," he called. "We got you surrounded, and there's nowhere to run." The sudden voice startled the Germans. All three jumped up in panic. Hinrich's hand went to his waist, though he had no weapon. Franz stood protectively in front of the sick Klaus. Fear spread across their faces. They had expected armed soldiers, not cowboys appearing out of nowhere. "Americans?" Hinrich shouted hoarsely, his English broken. "We surrender! You take us back?" He raised his hands, hoping they wouldn't shoot. What happened next shocked them completely. Billy's lasso whirled through the air with a whistle and looped perfectly around Franz's chest. The horse stepped back automatically, tightening the rope. Franz gasped as his arms were pinned to his sides, struggling in disbelief. In all his military experience, he had never imagined being captured like this, by cowboys using lassos like in the Western movies he'd once seen back in Germany. Before Hinrich could react, Roberto's rope flew and caught him across the shoulders. He fell backward into the dirt, breath knocked out, held firmly but unharmed. Klaus was too weak to move. He simply lifted his trembling hands and began to cry. James dismounted and walked over slowly. "Easy now," he said gently. "No one's gonna hurt you. You just need water." He handed his canteen to Klaus, who drank greedily until James pulled it back. "Slow down, son. Too much will make you sick." Sam looked around, satisfied. The whole thing had taken less than half a minute. No shots, no injuries, just quick, clean teamwork. He walked over to Hinrich, who sat stunned and dusty and crouched down beside him. "You speak English, soldier?" Sam asked. "Yes, some," Heinrich replied weakly, still in shock. "You are cowboys? Real cowboys?" The disbelief in his voice was almost childlike. For him, the legends of the American West, of horses, lassos, and wide-open land, had become real, but in the most humiliating way. He had been captured not by police or soldiers, but by ranchers with ropes. The cowboys tied simple leads from their lassos, linking the prisoners together so they could walk in front of the horses without running off. James gave each man water and a few pieces of dried meat. They needed food and rest for the long trip back to Camp Hearn, where their brief taste of freedom had come to an end. Sam sent Tommy ahead on the fastest horse to inform the authorities at Camp Hearn and the sheriff's office that the escaped prisoners had been found and were being brought back. As they started their long journey northeast, an unexpected conversation began between the captors and the captured men. Hinrich's English was rough but good enough to talk, and Roberto knew some German from his old neighbors. The fear the prisoners felt at first slowly turned into tired acceptance, and with that came curiosity from both sides. "Why did you run?" Sam asked Hinrich as they walked. "You're treated well in camp, right? You get food, shelter, and medical care. Better than what our boys get in German camps, from what I've heard." His tone wasn't harsh. He truly wanted to understand. Sam knew from reports that Camp Hearn's prisoners lived under conditions better than what the Geneva Convention required. Hinrich tried to explain in broken English. "In camp, we are still prisoners, still defeated. We are soldiers. We must fight. We must try to escape, rejoin our army. It is our duty." His voice was weak but firm. The military training drilled into him during his service made it clear that a soldier should never accept being a prisoner without trying to escape. Billy chuckled, not in a mean way. "Son, you're in Texas. You're over 1,000 miles from the Mexican border, and that's if you walk straight, which you didn't. Then you'd have to cross Mexico and find a ship willing to take a German soldier. Did you even think that through?" His words were almost caring, pointing out the hopelessness of their plan. Franz, walking behind, said something in German, and Heinrich translated, "He says we thought maybe German submarines, U-boats, could come near the Mexican coast and take us home." The idea hung in the air like a dream, and even Franz seemed to realize how foolish it sounded. By 1943, German submarines were rarely seen near North America, and the thought of one showing up to rescue 3 escaped prisoners was pure fantasy. The group walked through the hot afternoon, stopping now and then in small patches of shade. Klaus, who felt better after some food and water, watched the cowboys closely. He had grown up on a small farm in Germany and was fascinated by how skilled these men were with their horses and gear. Through Hinrich's translation, he asked about ranching, how they cared for cattle, and how far they traveled. James Cooper rode beside them and explained how ranches in Texas covered thousands of acres, how they moved cattle by season, and how they managed breeding and sales. Klause listened carefully, comparing it with German farming. For a brief time, enemies found common ground through their shared knowledge of the land and animals. As the sun lowered in the west, turning the prairie golden, they reached the main road leading back to Camp Hearn. Sam stopped one last time by a small creek so everyone could rest and drink. The German soldiers sat quietly, exhausted. Hinrich looked at the cowboys with both respect and shame. He had fought in North Africa under Rommel, survived desert battles, and been captured in Tunisia, but never imagined being caught again by cowboys with ropes, like runaway cattle. When they finally reached Camp Hearn at dusk, word had already spread. Other German prisoners gathered behind the fence to watch. Military police, officers, and even a local newspaper photographer waited at the gate. The sight of 3 dirty, tired German soldiers tied up and led by Texas cowboys on horseback looked straight out of a movie. Major Robert Wilson, the assistant commander, came forward. "Mr. Mackenzie, I hear you and your men helped the army today," he said formally but with respect. Sam nodded, got off his horse, and handed the ropes to the military police. Found them about 30 miles northwest, heading toward the Brazos River. They were in bad shape, tired, thirsty, lost. "We gave them food and water." The Germans stood weakly as the guards took over, their uniforms torn and faces red from the sun. Other prisoners called out in German, some with sympathy, some with anger. Hinrich kept his head down, feeling the heavy weight of failure. Franz and Klause just seemed relieved it was over. Their dreams of freedom had been destroyed by the reality of the Texas wilderness. Records in the National Archives show that captured escapees usually faced minor punishment, sometime in isolation and loss of privileges, but never physical harm, as the Geneva rules forbade it. Camp Hearn followed those rules strictly, hoping the Germans would treat American prisoners in Europe the same way. As the prisoners were taken away for medical checks, the photographer snapped pictures that would soon appear in newspapers across Texas. The images showed the cowboys looking calm and confident beside their horses, lassos hanging neatly from their saddles, like heroes from a Western film. Behind them, German prisoners stared through the fence, showing shock, amusement, or disappointment. The contrast between American cowboy life and German military discipline was striking. Major Wilson invited Sam and his men inside for coffee and questioning. They sat around a plain wooden table while officers took notes. Billy showed how he used his lasso, explaining that the same method used to catch a steer could stop a running man without hurting him. The officers asked about tracking and pursuit, impressed by their skill. "They were lost and scared," Sam said simply. "Military training don't help much if you don't know the land. They're just young men doing what they think is right." His words carried quiet wisdom and several officers nodded. Before leaving, Major Wilson shook each cowboy's hand. "The Army thanks you, gentlemen. You probably saved those men's lives. Heat kills fast out here." He handed Sam a small envelope with a cash reward. Sam accepted it without fuss, planning to share it with his crew. As the cowboys rode off into the night, Camp Hearn returned to its usual rhythm. Guards patrolled, prisoners lined up for dinner, and life in captivity continued as before. Hinrich, Franz, and Klause sat in the infirmary, getting treated for dehydration and sunburn. They spoke little, lost in their thoughts about their failed escape and strange capture. In the weeks that followed, their story spread far beyond Texas. Military papers wrote about the cowboys who caught German soldiers, turning it into a tale of humor and pride. It fit perfectly into American legend. Clever cowboys using old frontier skills to outsmart enemy soldiers. Cartoonists drew funny pictures of cowboys chasing Germans across the plains. But for Hinrich, Franz, and Klause, it wasn't funny. After medical treatment, they spent 2 weeks alone in punishment cells, thinking about how their dream of freedom had ended with ropes, horses, and a group of Texans who treated them better than they expected. During this time, the prisoners had a lot of time to think about how badly their escape plan had failed, and the strange cultural clash they had gone through. Hinrich felt the humiliation most deeply. As an officer, he had expected that if he were caught trying to escape, it would be by military police or government officers, not by ordinary ranchers who treated him like a runaway animal, tying him up and leading him back like a lost cow. The camp leaders used the event as a lesson for other prisoners. During required meetings, they showed maps that displayed how far it was to reach any neutral country, explained the harsh conditions of Texas, and described how local people often helped stop escape attempts. They even showed the newspaper photos of the cowboys with their lassos, making it clear that any future escape plans would only end in shame and failure. The message was simple: accept your situation, work together peacefully, and wait until the war is over. Research from the University of Texas later showed that after stories like the cowboy capture spread, the number of escape attempts from Texas prison camps dropped sharply. Many prisoners realized that trying to escape was pointless, especially as the camps improved and news spread that Germany was losing the war. Klaus Schneider accepted reality the fastest. Young and practical, he focused on living well inside the camp. He joined the camp orchestra, playing the accordion, and worked on local farms where he got along well with the Texas farmers because of his farming background. By late 1944, Klaus was trusted enough to work outside the camp without constant supervision. His memory of being caught by the cowboy faded from shame into a story he could later tell with a laugh. Franz took much longer to come to terms with things. His stubborn attitude that had driven him to escape now caused him to rebel against camp rules. He often argued with guards, broke minor rules, and ended up spending time in isolation. But by 1945, as the war went badly for Germany, even Franz gave up resisting. He began to realize that being a prisoner in Texas was far better than being in a war-torn homeland. Hinrich Müller, however, went through a deeper change. The proud officer who had led the escape attempt became quiet and thoughtful. He spent long hours reading in the camp library, especially books about American history and the Old West. He wanted to understand the country that had defeated him. Reading about cowboys and settlers helped him understand why Sam Mackenzie and his men had been so skilled at tracking and catching them. He began to see the difference between European and American ideas of independence and survival. By the time the war ended in 1945, Hinrich had gained a new respect for the Americans, especially the cowboys who had recaptured him. When the process of sending prisoners home began in 1945 and 1946, Hinrich asked for permission to write a letter to Sam Mackenzie. The camp commander agreed and helped him send it. In the letter, later found in family records, Hinrich thanked Sam for his fair treatment and admitted his respect for their skills. He wrote that being captured by cowboys was, in its own way, an unusual honor. Over time, the story of the German prisoners who were caught with lassos by Texas cowboys became a famous tale in Robertson County. It was retold in bars, family gatherings, and historical meetings. Sam Mackenzie became somewhat of a local celebrity. When people asked him to tell the story, he always did so humbly, saying, "We were just doing what had to be done. Those boys were lost, and we brought them back safely. That's all." Billy Patterson's roping skills became legendary across Texas. He showed his lassoing technique at rodeos and fairs, often telling the story of how he once roped a German soldier. Young cowboys practiced harder, joking that they'd be ready if more Germans ever tried to escape. The story helped strengthen the image of Texas cowboys as tough and capable men who could handle anything, whether it was herding cattle or catching prisoners. Camp Hearn closed in late 1945 after all the prisoners were sent home. Most of the camp buildings were taken down or reused, but the memory of the place lived on. Historical groups later worked to preserve its story, and the Hearn Chamber of Commerce put up signs explaining the camp's history, including the escape stories. The Texas Historical Commission recognized it as part of an important but often forgotten chapter of World War II on the American home front. More than 50,000 Axis prisoners, mostly Germans but also Italians and Japanese, were held in Texas camps. They worked on farms, helped build roads, and became part of the local community in surprising ways that blurred the lines between friend and enemy. Hinrich Müller returned to Germany in 1946 to find his hometown in ruins and under American control. He struggled for years, working different jobs before starting a small farming equipment business. He never forgot Texas. In the 1950s, he wanted to visit again as relations between Germany and the U.S. improved, but money stopped him. Still, he stayed in touch with some American veterans through friendship programs. When he died in 1973, his family found among his papers an old newspaper photo of the Cowboys outside Camp Hearn with their lassos. Franz went back to the Rhineland, took over his family's farm, and rarely spoke about the war. In his later years, however, he would sometimes tell his grandchildren, half embarrassed, half amused, how he was once caught like a cow by Texas cowboys. It became a funny story in the family, told in his heavy German accent. Klaus Schneider was the one whose life changed most positively. He moved to the U.S. in 1951, settled in Wisconsin, and worked as a farm manager. He often said his time as a prisoner in Texas taught him valuable lessons about American farming and open-mindedness. He became a U.S. citizen in 1957 and lived until 1998, sometimes speaking in schools about his unusual journey from enemy soldier to American immigrant. The story of the lassoing incident became more than just an amusing tale. It showed how the old traditions of the American West met the modern realities of global war. The cowboys used the same ranching skills their ancestors had used for generations, proving that old ways could still matter in a new age. Today, the story is kept alive in museums and archives, including at Texas A&M University and the National World War II Museum. Descendants of both the cowboys and the German prisoners have shared letters and photos, keeping the memory alive as a symbol of reconciliation and humanity after conflict. The land where it all happened still looks much the same. Wide open prairie, hot in summer, quiet and endless. Sometimes local historians lead tours to the area, showing visitors where the escape and capture took place. Standing there, one can imagine the fear, confusion, and irony of that summer day in 1943, when German soldiers running for freedom were suddenly caught by men on horseback in the heart of Texas.